In the spring of 1841, the people of Alton, Illinois, buried a child. Her name was Margaret Lane, 3 years old, fever in her lungs, cold in her tiny hands. They laid her in hallowed ground, in the new hillside cemetery overlooking the river. But that very night, the grave cracked open. No animal dug her up. No human hands disturbed the soil. The earth itself had pushed her out. Her tiny coffin sat above ground, the wood split like something inside had clawed its way out. And by morning 5 more coffins had surfaced, old ones from generations back. The townsfolk thought it was a flood, or the rain, or poor workmanship, but they buried them again, and again. The dead would not stay. That cemetery earned a name whispered through back alleys and locked doors, Whistler's Field, a mocking name, a cursed place. But the truth wasn't geological, it wasn't poor drainage. No. What they found underneath the soil changed the entire town. And then the records vanished. The cemetery refused to hold the dead, not because of what was buried, but because of what had been buried before the town was even founded, before Illinois was a state. Underneath that hill was something older than the town, older than the nation, something the native tribes refused to speak of directly. They only called it the breathing earth, a mound with a pulse. And in 1841, the settlers had unknowingly built a resting place for the dead atop something that had never, ever wanted to be disturbed. You think cemeteries are peaceful places. You think death is a silent keeper. But this one remembered the footsteps that desecrated it. And it didn't forget. Not the priests who blessed the land, not the children who played on the tombs, not the men who dug too deep. By 1843, the cemetery was sealed, and not because of fear, but because of what was seen underneath. But that's not the terrifying part. The terrifying part is this. After it was sealed, graves still appeared, new graves, fresh dirt, perfectly arranged. But no one saw them being dug, no one claimed the dead. And the names on those graves, they hadn't been born yet. Welcome to Whistler's Field, where death walks backwards and the ground writes its own future. They tried to flatten the hill, twice. Once with picks and shovels, once with fire. Neither worked. The soil, thick as wet ash, resisted the blade. Shovels bent, horses refused to tread, and when they set it aflame, when the preacher declared it must be cleansed, the fire curled back on itself. Witnesses said the wind died instantly, and then the flames turned black. Not smoke, the fire itself. It didn't spread outward, it sank downward, into the roots, into the bones, into the place no man had ever seen and lived sane. And that's when the dreams began. At first it was the gravedigger. They found him sitting bolt upright in the church pews at 3 a.m. muttering, "She's humming again, the little girl, the girl with no mouth." He clawed his own ears out that night. Then the mayor. He started locking his children in the cellar, screaming that the dirt songs were crawling up their spines while they slept. He left town on horseback in his nightclothes. Wasn't found for weeks. His horse returned alone. And every Sunday after that, more graves appeared. Perfect, clean, symmetrical, as if planned by an unseen hand. But the town's registry showed no deaths, no births, and no burials. Each new gravestone bore names the townsfolk didn't recognize. But when you read them aloud, something strange happened. People got sick, nauseous. One man vomited blood, another went blind in his left eye. Some claimed the stones changed when you looked away. The names would flicker, shift. Sometimes, one would spell your own. By 1845, the town voted to fence off the cemetery completely, but the blacksmith tasked with forging the iron gates never finished the job. They say he went mad trying to shape the metal, that every piece he hammered bent in the same unnatural direction, always away from the hill no matter how he turned it. And on the 7th night, when he finally gave up, he walked barefoot into the cemetery with a lantern and was never seen again. But the lantern returned, still lit, flickering red, sitting atop a fresh grave that hadn't been there the day before. And the name on the grave? His wife had never spoken it out loud, not even once, because it hadn't been given to him yet. That name was the name of his unborn son. A traveling minister came next. Reverend Elisha Crowthorne. He was young, sharp-eyed, with a firebrand voice that could make a crowd weep and shout in the same breath. He'd heard of Whistler's Field from a telegram sent in desperation by the town's last remaining pastor. The message was short. It read, "They rise without breath, come armed with scripture and salt." Crowthorne arrived with a Bible, 3 sacks of salt, and a silver crucifix that had been blessed at the Vatican itself. He lasted 2 days. The first night he stood at the gate with townsfolk gathered and read aloud from Psalms. The air twisted. Some said it went thin, like standing atop a mountain. Others said it thickened, like breathing through water. The grass browned beneath their feet. The birds stopped singing. The second night, he ventured in alone. He poured salt in a wide circle, recited the rites of binding, and nailed a cross into the center of the cemetery. And that night, everyone in town heard the scream, not of pain, not of fear, but of laughter, crooked, childlike, from every direction. The next morning they found the cross bent sideways, twisted like wax. The salt had turned black. And Crowthorne, he was found kneeling, alive, but unresponsive. Eyes wide, lips moving though no sound came. His Bible was open on the ground, but every page had been replaced. Not torn, not scribbled over. Replaced. Every word was in a language no one recognized. A circular script that seemed to writhe when stared at too long. Scholars would later call it a non-linear glyph pattern, but the native tribes, when shown copies, said only this: "That's not writing, that's breathing." Crowthorne never spoke again. He died 2 years later in an asylum in Ohio, but before he passed he carved a single phrase into the wall of his padded cell, over and over, hundreds of times. "We are already buried." But here's what chills the spine more than all the rest. Each letter of his message, the loops, the strokes, perfectly matched the mysterious symbols in the Bible he'd carried that night. He never saw that language before, but he knew how to write it. Some languages aren't learned, they're remembered. What if I told you the cemetery wasn't the curse? What if it was the lock, and someone had already found the key? In 1850, 9 years after the first burial rejected its grave, a man arrived in Alton under the name Silas Grange. No family, no papers, no past, just a black coat, a leather satchel, and eyes the color of slate. He didn't ask questions. He didn't seek work. He rented a room above the general store and began walking the perimeter of Whistler's Field every single night. People watched him from their windows. He walked like a pendulum, smooth, slow, measured. Sometimes he whispered to the ground, sometimes he laughed, and sometimes he wept. He never went inside. Not once. Until the night of the new moon. That's when something changed. A woman named Clara Dobbs, who lived in a cottage just uphill from the cemetery, was the first to see it. She told the town elders the sky folded. That's the word she used, folded, like cloth. She said she looked out her window and saw the cemetery upside down, like a reflection floating in mid-air. Graves hanging in the sky, trees dripping upward, and in the center was Silas Grange. Standing inside the gates. He hadn't walked through them. He had become part of them. When the townspeople investigated the next day, they found the iron gates melted, not broken, melted like butter on a skillet. The fence posts had fused together, the sign over the entrance was gone. In its place, a symbol scorched into the wood, a spiral made of teeth, not painted, grown. From that day on, Silas Grange was never seen again, but more graves began to appear, always 3 at a time, in perfect triangles, each with no name, just the spiral, the tooth spiral, always fresh. And then, The weather changed. Rain began to fall only around the cemetery, no matter the season. Storms would split in half over Whistler's Field, one side black as tea, the other bright and sunny. Crops near the cemetery grew twice as tall but tasted of copper. Cattle birthed calves with missing eyes. Birds stopped nesting in the trees nearby. And in the church basement, where they stored old town records, pages began going missing, not torn out, not stolen, dissolving. The ink faded, the paper thinned, as if the past itself was retracting, as if something deep in that soil was editing history. Let me tell you a secret that should never be said out loud. Whistler's Field isn't on any modern map. Search satellite images, look up cemetery records, you'll find nothing, just a patch of uneven land behind a tree line in Alton, listed as undeveloped private property. Even the GPS signal fractures near it, like it's caught between coordinates. But that wasn't always the case. In 1897, a man named Thaddeus Blake came to Alton under the guise of a cartographer. But his real work, he was what the church used to call a map suppressor, a quiet agent who made places disappear. He carried an ink pen made from a crow's feather and a bundle of parchment stitched from pigskin. Wherever he went, towns lost pieces of themselves. He didn't come to chart Whistler's Field. He came to erase it. He spent 3 weeks sketching, measuring, and recording the hill's details by hand. Locals said they'd see him tracing circles in the mud with his bare fingers, whispering things that didn't sound like English. One night a boy followed him and saw him drawing a perfect spiral using teeth. Animal, human, some too large to name. The boy never spoke again. Blake submitted his final map to the local land office. And then the strangest thing happened. The original map of Alton, the one hanging in the mayor's hall for 50 years, curled into ash overnight. No fire, no tampering, it self-immolated. The ashes fell in a spiral, and that was the first time townsfolk noticed something worse than death: forgetting. People began to lose memories. Whole families vanished from records, but also from minds. Men would visit their own homes and not recognize their children. Teachers forgot how to read. Women forgot who they were married to. Every name near Whistler's Field began to rot from the inside out, spoken less, remembered less, and once a name disappeared from every living tongue. The corresponding gravestone cracked open, not from the top, from underneath. That's when it became clear. This cemetery was not a resting place. It was a mouth. And every forgotten name was just another meal. But the question you need to ask yourself is, who or what is feeding? And more importantly, what happens when it gets hungry again? There was one survivor, one man who claimed to have escaped the pull of Whistler's Field after being inside it for 3 nights. His name was Daniel Hollow, a railroad worker who took a shortcut through the tree line on a dare. Drunk, proud, laughing. By morning, he was gone. Search parties found nothing. No tracks, no signs of struggle. Just his pocket watch, half buried in the soil at the cemetery's edge, ticking backward. 3 days later, Daniel stumbled out of the woods barefoot, covered in blood that wasn't his. His fingernails were missing, his eyes wide, pupils dilated like someone who'd seen the edge of the world and didn't like what stared back. He spoke only once. They sat him in the church, hands shaking, clothes shredded. The sheriff asked him what he saw. Daniel whispered, "The roots don't go down. They go inward." And then he passed out. He never woke again. He died 12 hours later. No cause, no trauma. Heart just stopped. But his final words haunted the town like a plague. The roots don't go down, they go inward. You see, that's the part most people miss. This was never about the bodies. It was about the soil. Because every piece of it, every grain, every speck, is alive. Not in the metaphorical sense, not like nature or fungus or decomposition, alive, like listening. Townsfolk began to report sounds coming from underground, not moaning, not clawing, whispers, whole conversations just below the surface, sometimes in English, sometimes in a low, gurgling tongue no one could repeat. Children claimed to hear their own names being called. Some said they heard voices practicing their names like someone was trying them on. Then came the mimicry. A woman named Ruth Lavin found her husband knocking on the door after midnight. Pale, confused, bleeding from the ears, she let him in, fed him, sat with him until morning. But when the real husband arrived at dawn, he found Ruth dead in her chair. No signs of struggle, no wounds. Just this. Her hands were buried in the fireplace ash, digging downward, desperately, as if trying to reach something below, and in the ash a single word had been traced with her fingertips before death stilled them. Mirror. Whatever lives beneath Whistler's Field, it doesn't just watch, it rehearses. By 1902, the town was broken. Not from war, not from poverty, but from the slow, bleeding disintegration of reality itself. Alton became a place where clocks ran differently in each home, where compasses spun in circles near the western ridge, where time didn't stop, but recurred. People reported reliving the same conversations, the same mistakes, the same final words of dead loved ones, looping, echoing, like someone had pressed rewind and was watching their grief on repeat. That's when the dreams escalated. Multiple townspeople, dozens, began having the same dream. A tunnel beneath the cemetery. Endless. Alive. Breathing. Lit by the faint glow of bioluminescent roots that pulsed like veins. The tunnel always curved left. Always left. And always at the end, they saw a door. A door made of jawbones, fused, interlocked, human, animal, unknown. And behind that door, a sound. They never remembered the sound, only the effect. Men woke screaming, women miscarried. One boy woke with grey hair. Then, one Sunday in April, 7 residents climbed the cemetery fence. They were not together. They did not speak. They simply walked. One by one, none returned. But by dusk, 7 new graves had appeared, with dates 10 years into the future. 7 names, 7 deaths, 7 prophecies. The sheriff ordered the graves exhumed that night. What they found were empty caskets, each one filled with the personal belongings of the people who had vanished. Shoes, journals, wedding rings, pocket watches, but nothing recent. Everything aged, rusted, yellowed, as if the graves had been there for decades. One of the coffins contained a mirror, but not just any mirror. A round, handheld one, antique silver frame, scorched black at the edges. The glass shimmered with a faint green tint. When the deputy picked it up, he collapsed. He didn't speak again for 5 years. When he Finton, Ally did, all he said was, "It doesn't show your reflection. It shows the one who's watching you." That mirror now resides in a vault in Springfield under 24-hour armed guard. No one is allowed to view it, not anymore. Because in 1924, a senator's daughter looked into it for less than 3 seconds. She began speaking fluent Sumerian and gouged out her own eyes with a letter opener. They say she smiled as she did it. Here's where it gets worse. Because what you're hearing now, what's been buried, silenced, sealed, was never truly forgotten. Pieces of Whistler's Field kept surfacing like bones in a flood. The deeper you dig into history, the more it scratches back. In 1931, an academic named Dr. Howard Leclerc uncovered documents from the original French settlers who explored the region a century before the cemetery was built. These weren't diaries or letters. They were warnings. scrawled in a dialect of Old French, barely legible, barely sane. The translated fragment spoke of une terre d'envers, the land of reversals, a place where roots grow upward, and the sky can be heard beneath the ground, where burial is not a ritual of rest, but a transaction. They spoke of black moss that grows on the inside of the lungs, of frogs with 2 tongues, of humming that comes from your spine. One account mentions a ritual they watched, performed in silence by a native elder wrapped in crowskin, who scattered bone dust across the hill and whispered, "Do not plant your dead in a place that remembers the living." Dr. Leclerc published none of it. Why? Because days after making his final notes, he mailed his own severed tongue to the University of Chicago with a single-page message written in his blood. Truth must be forgotten, or it becomes hunger. The letter was dismissed as a hoax. But here's what you're not supposed to know. Every researcher who's touched this topic, cartographers, historians, cryptographers, has reported the same symptom, a creeping awareness that something is watching them. Not paranoia, not delusion, awareness, like a shape behind a curtain. And just before they vanish, each one, without exception, scratches or writes the same sigil somewhere in their home, their office, or their skin, the spiral of teeth. Now let me ask you something. Have you seen it before? Not in this video, not today. Before. In your dreams, on walls that shouldn't have patterns, on your old notebooks in the corners drawn without knowing why. You think this is just a story? No. This is a test. A test to see how deep the rabbit hole can go before you start remembering too. If you're still watching, comment this phrase twice to lock it into your bones. The ground has eyes. The ground has eyes. Let the algorithm know you're awake now. Let's go deeper. Because here's what the surface-level historians missed, and what the real architects of silence erased. Whistler's Field is not unique. It's not a glitch in nature. It's a pattern of convergence. Points on the earth where memory collapses, time stutters, and identity becomes unanchored. The old religions called them mouths of reversal, places where the veil is so thin it breathes, where burial is not an end, but an invitation. Whistler's Field is merely the best hidden one in North America. There are others, a churchyard in southern France that smells like burnt hair after rain, a cave in Siberia where every echo speaks back with the voice of your mother, and a lake in Namibia that reflects stars which don't exist in our sky anymore. Each one said marked by the spiral, each one hungry. And guess what? Each was buried beneath something sacred. Cemeteries, churches, orphanages, hospitals, institutions meant to heal, protect, or sanctify. But those weren't choices of ignorance. They were precautions. Locks. Built not to worship what's holy, but to contain what isn't. Now here's the part that no one dares to say, even in whispers. The entities beneath these places, they don't sleep. They observe, patiently, because they're not dead. They were never alive. They are memory itself, sentient, starving, slithering through root systems, bloodlines, and forgotten names. When you forget something, anything, it doesn't disappear. It has to go somewhere. And these places, they collect it. All of it. The trauma you buried, the name you swore you'd never say again, the face you forgot from that one dream you weren't supposed to remember. They remember it for you, and sometimes they give it back. But when it returns, it's never quite the same. In Alton, in the dead center of Whistler's Field, the soil is now warm year-round, even in snow. It pulses slightly when walked on barefoot. Children who step on it are known to speak in voices far older than their years. One girl, age 6, looked her mother dead in the eye and asked, "Do you remember burying me the first time?" The mother had only one child. She left town the next morning. Her house collapsed a week later. No cause, no warning, just dust. And in the dust, the spiral. By 1947, the US government took interest. Not publicly, of course. No flags, no soldiers, just a string of plain-suited men in unmarked cars, black hats and blank eyes, sent under an agricultural development project no one remembers authorizing. But they didn't bring farming tools. They brought seismographs, containment rods, neuroacoustic equipment, and something referred to in one report as a recursive echo stabilizer, technology decades ahead of what was available, even in wartime. They built a perimeter, poured concrete over the field, stamped it as a condemned site for chemical contamination, but beneath the surface, they weren't trying to clean it. They were listening. Over 3 months, their machines recorded a low-frequency hum, consistent and rhythmic, identical to a human heartbeat. But not one heartbeat, millions, overlapping, like a choir of pulses buried deep in the earth. Then came the voices. One tape, marked Classified Level 7, was leaked decades later by a whistleblower from a now-defunct agency. You can't find it online anymore. The internet swallows it faster than it spreads. But if you ever hear it, if you accidentally stumble upon it, you'll notice something terrifying. The voice on the tape says your own name first, clear, calm, like it's been waiting. Then it says things you've never told anyone. Your first fear. The dream you had as a child that made you stop sleeping for a week. The thought you swore you buried so deep even you couldn't reach it anymore. And then, silence. Except not silence. Breathing. Wet. Uneven. Close. After that tape leaked, 4 people took their own lives. 2 disappeared. The facility was quietly decommissioned, the records sealed, and the concrete slab above Whistler's Field was buried under 40 feet of gravel. But the hum never stopped. Construction workers near the site have since reported tinnitus that syncs with their heartbeats. Some claim to hear their father's voices, even if their fathers are long dead. One man said he heard his unborn son calling him from under the dirt. The government knows, but they're not trying to stop it. They're trying to learn from it, because somewhere along the line they realized this isn't a threat to humanity, it's an evolution, and some men are ready to feed it. The men who stayed behind, the ones who didn't run from the whispers, who weren't devoured by the dreams, they began to change. Not overnight. Slowly. Strategically. Almost like ritual programming. You see, Whistler's Field doesn't kill indiscriminately. It selects, it molds, it conditions minds that resonate at the right frequency, men with unresolved trauma, men with secrets, men who've stared too long into the mirror and wondered if someone else is staring back. They called themselves the Quiet Fold. Never more than 7 at a time, never in public. But each knew the spiral, each knew the breath of the soil. They never called it worship, they called it integration. Their doctrine was simple. Memory is a chain. Time is a lie. Death is a doorway that swings both ways. And they believed Whistler's Field wasn't just alive. It was sentient. Not in the way animals are, but in the way viruses are. It doesn't think. It replicates. Each member of the Quiet Fold tattooed their left hand with a circular mark, 7 concentric rings, each broken by a line of teeth, and they vanished from the census. Their names disappeared from public records, their land deeds collapsed, their bank accounts dissolved as if they never existed. But they were never missing. They were beneath. One farmer, Isaac Munson, kept a diary hidden inside the walls of his barn. In it he describes rituals, sleepless nights, blood offerings, but not of animals, not even of humans, of memory itself. They practiced forgetting on purpose. He writes, I gave it the name of my mother. I gave it the face of my child. It feasted on the warmth of their memory, and in return, it showed me the moment before my birth. On the final page, he writes, I no longer sleep. I breathe with it now. I don't remember who I was, and it doesn't matter. That man is beneath me now. The quiet fold didn't worship Whistle, Bars Field. They became it. Because that's what the spiral offers, not just power over death, but escape from identity, freedom from the cage of memory, the obliteration of the self, a chance to dissolve into something older. Not everyone fears that. Some men crave it, and those men don't die. They scatter, and they seed. Let's rip the veil even further. Because if you think this is just about one cemetery in Illinois, you're not thinking big enough. You're still trapped in linear time, still bound to the comfort of cause and effect. But Whistler's Field doesn't exist in time. It exists through it. That's why the dates on the graves go forward. That's why people see their names carved before they're born. The soil isn't just aware, it's predictive. It doesn't record death. It writes it. Backwards, sideways, in spirals. There's a reason the spiral of teeth is the symbol that returns again and again. It's not just a glyph. It's a geometry of influence. The ancients knew this. Not from Illinois, from Babylon, from Ur, from the forgotten black temples buried beneath the Euphrates. There are tablets, never shown to the public, that depict burial mounds shaped like teeth, spiraling into the earth like drills. Not for interment, for injection. These sites weren't made to hold the dead. They were made to plant something. And here's what will tear your understanding wide open. One of those tablets, housed in a locked drawer beneath the British Museum, depicts an image that matches Whistler's Field down to the tree line. The hill, the three-grave triangle, the black sap that bleeds from the bark. Identical. Only this carving dates to 2200 BC. Explain that. You can't. Because the spiral doesn't grow on a timeline. It returns to fertile ground again and again, wearing different masks, different languages, different religions. It takes the form of shrines in India, burial caves in Peru, sunken cathedrals in Norway. And now, a cemetery in Illinois no one can remember building. We thought we built over the past, but the past builds through us. And Whistler's Field is not dead. It is gestating, feeding on forgotten memories, on unspoken names, on identity left unguarded. And when it finally cracks open, when the spiral blooms in full across the skin of the earth, it won't look like apocalypse. It'll look like revelation. And those who remembered too much, they'll be gone, not buried, unwritten. Because to it, you are not a person. You are a sentence, and when you're no longer useful to the story, you get edited out. In late autumn of 1841, a woman named Agnes Corwin began screaming in her sleep. At first, her husband thought it was a passing fever, but the screams were too specific. She shouted names, dates, exact hours, disturbing details spoken with terrifying clarity, like a death rattle before it ever arrived. At 2:07 a.m. on October 11th, she whispered a name, Marybeth Lawn. By dawn, a 6-year-old girl in a nearby township, Marybeth Lawn, was found drowned in a stone well her family didn't know existed on their property. No footprints around it, no water in her lungs, just her tiny hand clutching a wooden rosary, so old it predated the colonists. And this was only the beginning. Over the next 12 nights, Agnes spoke over 40 names. Each one died within 48 hours, always violently, always mysteriously, sometimes with their eyes open in perfect terror, as if they had seen something before they died, something that emptied them out. The townspeople, terrified, dragged Agnes to the church and demanded an exorcism. But Father Clemens, the old Lutheran priest, refused. "She is not cursed," he said. She is receiving a signal. No one believed him, until he showed them her hands, covered in blisters, shaped like concentric circles, pulsing with blood beneath the skin. A spiral. The same one found carved into the tree bark at Whistler's Field. The same one the British Museum was hiding in that Sumerian tablet. The same one now appearing in the fog on people's mirrors when they woke up too early, before sunrise had a chance to kill it. You see, Agnes wasn't haunted. She was tuned. A receiver. Some have theorized the soil beneath Whistler's Field acts like a great natural antenna, transmitting something not from the sky but from deep below. A frequency that hits only certain people, at certain moments, in states of vulnerability. Pregnancy, delirium, dream, and midwives, like Agnes, positioned between life and death, are the perfect conductors. But Agnes didn't last long. On the 13th night she stopped screaming. They found her body in the field behind her house, every tooth missing, not pulled, gone, as if they'd never existed. But worse than the body was the message burned into the door of her home. 3 words, scorched into the wood from within. She spoke aloud. 2 weeks after Agnes Corwin's death, silence returned to the town. Not peace, silence, a vacuum, a stillness so unnatural even the insects refused to hum. But Whistler's Field, that cursed patch of earth just past the elm trees, was not silent. It sang. Nightly, low at first, like the soft rustle of distant wind through dead wheat. But as the days passed, the sound grew. Voices layered over each other, some shrill and weeping, others deep and resonant, humming in unison, always in the same rhythm, always in the same key. C-E-A. The exact triad used by 13th century Benedictine monks when reciting incantations meant to bind spirits beneath the ground. Local children called it the Death Choir. They dared each other to stand near the field after sundown, but no one ever lasted more than 2 minutes. Their noses would bleed, their knees would give out. One boy, Eddie Tallman, walked home muttering a phrase in a dead language no one could identify. He died 3 days later after tearing out his own ears. What made it stranger was that this field, Whistler's Field, had been silent for centuries. It wasn't even considered haunted before 1841. In fact, many used to believe it was blessed. It was where marriages were held, where crops sprouted earliest, where people claimed to see glowing stones buried just under the dirt, humming like warm breath in winter. But something shifted, and that shift, as later revealed by a forgotten page in the Corwin family Bible, coincided with the return of something old. The page showed a crude drawing, a spiral carved in fire around a figure with no face. Beneath it, a note in Agnes's handwriting. It hears when we breathe. It counts when we name. It sings when we forget. This would have been dismissed as poetic nonsense except for one detail. When a group of researchers visited the area in 1937 to conduct soil tests, they brought with them a phonograph to record ambient noise. What they captured was not wind. It wasn't static. It was voices. A choir, yes, but singing in a perfectly reversed cadence, every consonant sharp, every vowel swallowed. They reversed the recording again, slowed it down, and heard one phrase repeated over and over: she should not have spoken. That's when they realized the death choir wasn't singing to the living, it was singing about them. By the spring of 1842, Whistler's Field had become a place no one dared approach, not even during daylight, yet the strangest detail had gone largely unnoticed. Across from the field, just past the twisted oak roots of Brim Hollow Road, stood a house that no one remembered building. No record of purchase, no family name, no mail, no signs of renovation or decay. It simply existed. And it had always been there. Or so it seemed. The locals called it the Nameless House. From afar, it looked like any other two-story home, grey siding, a porch, shutters that hung crooked like sleeping eyes. But no one remembered seeing it 5 years ago, or even 1 year ago. And when people tried to draw it from memory, each sketch was different, yet all carried the same disturbing trait. No windows, none. Not in front, not on the sides, not even in the attic. Just blank space where one's mind expected to see openings. Elias Munro, the town's unofficial historian, grew obsessed. He claimed the house was parasitic, that it didn't just stand on the land but fed off of it. He believed Whistler's Field and the nameless house were one and the same, two organs of a deeper entity buried beneath the town, now stirring. Elias tried to enter. Neighbors saw him walk through the gate, but he never knocked. The door opened on its own. He stepped inside. He did not return. That night, his wife heard knocking. When she opened the door, there was no one, just a small wax cylinder placed gently on the step, a phonograph recording. The town gathered in the chapel to play it. At first, silence. Then, a soft scratching, like fingernails on paper. Then, Elias's voice. I walked in. I couldn't see. But I heard singing. Not the choir. Something older. Something beneath it. His breath quickened. The walls. They moved. Not like they were alive, but like they were watching me forget who I was. Then a whisper. Not Elias. You are here now. And here has no name. Screaming followed, then static. The recording melted in the machine. And the house? The next day it was gone. No trace, just flattened grass, damp and black as if something had soaked up light itself. But a week later it reappeared, somewhere else. And the death choir, it began singing in harmony. By winter of 1843, the strange harmonies first heard in Whistler's Field had drifted northeast, over rivers and ridgelines, through frozen soil and tangled brush, finally arriving in the low farmlands of Elkhart County, Indiana. It began as a hum, barely perceptible, like wind vibrating through hollow bones. The residents near Pigeon Creek said they felt the sound more than heard it, as if it came from inside their bones, spines rattling at night, teeth aching during prayer. The livestock refused to face east. Roosters stopped crowing. Dogs circled themselves endlessly, tails down and eyes wide. At the town's Lutheran chapel, the old organist, Marta Reinsfeld, collapsed mid-hymn. Witnesses say she froze at the keys, her fingers hovering over middle C, eyes rolled back. She whispered one phrase before fainting. They've tuned the land. When she awoke, she claimed a symphony of unseen voices had filled the church, not just singing, but calling. Over the next week, 27 children from the township fell ill with identical symptoms, high fever, bloodshot eyes, and most disturbingly, spontaneous whistling from the lungs, even as they slept. The doctors could find no infection, no pathogen, just lungs that whistled in unison in a minor key no one could name. Then one night, January 9th, those children began to speak in the same voice. Simultaneously, from 17 different homes, the same sentence echoed, "We are the instrument, and the land is being played." The phrase was heard across the township, echoing through walls and rafters. 2 nights later, Father Joseph Clay, the local priest, led a midnight vigil. He believed the only way to stop the sound was to overpower it with sacred music. He gathered 30 voices, trained them in Latin chants, and marched toward the old mill where the singing seemed strongest. What followed was never documented, the whispered about. Survivors say the choir entered the mill, chanting Dies Irae in perfect harmony. The structure groaned. Windows cracked. Then came the sound of laughter, thousands of children laughing in reverse. The mill collapsed inward, not as if crushed, but erased from reality. The vigil choir, gone. No bodies, no debris. But in the wheat fields, in perfect crop circle spirals, a new pattern emerged. Not letters, not symbols, Musical notation. Notes etched into soil, too complex for the human voice, as if something larger than history was beginning to compose itself. 6 months after the Elkhart mill vanished, a different kind of resonance emerged, one not sung but struck. July 1843, Bowling Green, Kentucky. A farmer named Amos Garver unearthed something while digging fence posts, about 2 feet down, nestled among tree roots. A bell, not rusted, not broken, and not cast in any metal known to local blacksmiths. It was black, not painted, but born black, a surface like obsidian, but soft to the touch, cold even in summer heat. And when Amos tapped it with his spade, it didn't ring. It hummed, low, steady, eerie. He dragged it home with the help of his sons and left it on their porch overnight. That was a mistake. Every dog within 10 miles howled until dawn. Birds flew in erratic, spiraling patterns, crashing into trees. The Garver family couldn't sleep, not because of the noise, but because of the dreams. They all had the same one, a tower in the woods made of inverted stone with stairs that spiraled down instead of up. Inside was a cloaked figure with no hands, only sleeves, and the black bell, suspended in air, turning slowly without being touched. At its center, a hollow that didn't show the other side, but something else, something like teeth. By morning, Amos was gone. His boots were still on the porch, but the bell was gone too. A search party turned up nothing until the 5th night. That's when the bell rang. Not from a house, not from a church, but from beneath the town. The ground itself sang, one loud, impossible note that cracked every pane of glass in a 3-mile radius. That night, half the town's residents packed up and left, but a few stayed behind, drawn to the sound. They began building something. Not a house, not a church, but a spiral of stones and trees and rope and mirrors. They didn't speak, they didn't eat, they worked through the night, dozens of them. When questioned, they answered, read only in verse. The bell's not from heaven, nor from hell. It's from the silence that came before the first yell. And then, one by one, they vanished. The spiral remained, but the center, gone, dug out, deep, smooth, polished. And if you dropped a stone in, it didn't make a sound, not even a splash. The bell was never found again. But 5 towns over, someone began humming. A tune no one taught them. A tune no one could forget. By spring of 1844, Western Kentucky had learned to stop asking questions. Too many answers came with echoes. But one town still dared. Cane Ridge. Isolated. Forest surrounded. Known for its orphanage. A grand stone building perched on a hilltop run by nuns so severe they made thunder seem polite. The orphans were rarely seen, never heard, until they sang. March the 3rd. A thunderstorm so violent it split 2 trees down the middle, yet no lightning was seen, no rain fell. Instead, the sky bled. Locals described it as red rain, thick droplets staining roofs, dresses, even sheep. It wasn't paint, it wasn't rust, it was heavier, warmer, biological. And as it fell, the orphans began to sing, not from within the orphanage, but from the roof. All 27 children stood in perfect rows, eyes closed, mouths open. No one saw them climb, no ladder, no stairs, and the building had no roof access. The song? It wasn't English. It wasn't language. It was tonal geometry, a sequence of pitches and pauses that bent the ears like a spiral staircase bends the mind. Several residents reported spontaneous bleeding from the nose and ears. One woman, Margaret Lynn, 32, collapsed in her kitchen and awoke speaking backward Latin. Her husband hanged himself the next morning. The next night the children sang again. And this time, so did the trees. Their branches moved in sync, not swaying, but gesturing, signing the same patterns the children sang. By the third night, the nuns were gone. No trace, no screams. Their quarters were locked from the inside. In their place, inside each nun's bed, was a small bundle of hair and teeth, wrapped in red linen stitched with an untranslatable script. The sheriff ordered the building shut, boarded, sealed, left to rot. But on April 11th, a farmer passing nearby saw something through the upper window. A figure, not a child, not even human in shape. Elongated limbs, head crowned with antlers made of bone. It didn't move, but its mouth opened. And though the glass was thick and the wind was dead, the farmer heard the tune, that same unbearable, beautiful tune. He fled. 2 days later, the orphanage burned to the ground. No one set the fire, no one fought it. But when the ash settled, 27 perfect circles of unburnt grass lay around the foundation. And in the center of each, a child's shoe, pointing west. After the orphanage fire, Kentucky's western towns became whisper cities. People spoke in gestures, in codes. Doors were locked before sundown, not out of fear of criminals, but visitors. Visitors with hollow eyes. They came from the north, first spotted near the Missouri border in towns like Benton and Sykeston. Nobody saw them arrive. They were simply standing, at the edge of fields, on riverbanks, always silent, always still. Men in black suits, but not the kind worn by preachers or politicians. These had no seams, no buttons, just a slick, fabric-like skin, stitched too close to the bone. Their faces were not hidden, but not right either. No eyebrows, no lips, no eyelids. And those eyes, sunken craters rimmed with ash, as if burned inward by staring at something no man should. They didn't speak, not aloud, but people heard them anyway. Whole sentences placed inside their heads, like thoughts that weren't theirs. You know us. You invited us. The door opened. One farmer, Samuel Crick, claimed a hollow-eyed man stood in his barn for 7 nights straight. His cattle refused to enter, his children wouldn't sleep. On the 8th night, Crick took his rifle and fired directly into the figure's chest. The bullet passed through, no blood, no recoil. The figure didn't fall, didn't flinch. It just smiled, or tried to. Its skin cracked where a mouth should have been. A tearing motion, horizontal and too wide. No teeth, just black wetness inside. Crick collapsed and never stood again. Paralysis with no injury. The doctor wrote it off as stroke. But Crick's wife swore it was the song. He hummed it in his sleep. The same impossible melody from the orphanage, the same red rain rhythm. Then came the vanishings. Whole families. 5 at once from a single church, gone with no signs of struggle. Doors still locked, food still warm. Just an absence, like the dancer. A very presence had been undone. One note was found, scrawled on a child's Bible. They are what happens when we read the wrong verses out loud. By winter, those who remained in the border towns began sealing their ears with wax. A preventative measure, but still from deep inside the woods you could hear it. That melody, that climbing, circling tune, coming from nowhere, or perhaps from beneath, from under the ground. Waiting, listening, learning how to sing back. Buried in the archives of St. Mary's Cathedral in Louisville is a diary bound in cracked oxblood leather. It smells of rust and roses. The pages stick like skin. It belonged to Father Elias Callahan, an Irish Jesuit who arrived in Kentucky in the spring of 1846 to investigate the rash of unsolvable vanishings in the region's western parishes. What he found drove him to silence, then to madness, then to something worse. The diary was not meant for eyes. It is written in bursts, paragraphs interrupted by crosses, blood drops, and phrases struck out so violently they tear the parchment. But from what scholars could decipher, one entry stands out. There is a vein that runs beneath the land, deeper than coal, older than blood. The old ones drank from it, and now the vein drinks back. He spoke of a geological anomaly stretching from the Missouri border all the way to the foot of the Appalachians, a vein of black-red stone warm to the touch that sings when cracked. Father Callahan believed the orphanage fire, the hollow-eyed men, even the disappearances, all stemmed from this underground artery, a wound in the earth that had opened. Worse, someone had taught it how to feel. His diary describes a ritual site deep in the Red River Gorge, glyphs not of Cherokee or settler origin, but something earlier. Depictions of long-limbed figures pouring liquids into the earth, children bound with reeds, the spiral symbol repeated over and over. He refers to them only as the gatherers. And one passage, nearly illegible from smudged ink and blood, whispers, "They don't worship the vein. They feed it, because the vein remembers every drop." Shortly after this entry, Father Callahan vanished. Not ran, vanished. His vestments were found on the church floor, still warm, candles melted into odd angles, his diary placed deliberately atop an open Bible, Psalm 88 circle, it in red ink. "You have put me in the lowest pit, in the darkest depths." The Vatican sent 2 men to retrieve the book. One refused to take it on the return ship, said it breathed. The other man delivered it to Rome. He bled from his eyes for 3 days and died with one word carved into his chest: return. The diary remains locked. But late at night, archivists say, if you pass the room where it sleeps, you'll hear scratching. Not from inside the book, but under the floor. In the winter of 1847, in a small Catholic boarding school nestled between the Kentucky River and the Ashland forests, 13 boys, ages 8 to 12, sang a hymn so beautifully, so perfectly in harmony, that none of them survived it. The school was St. Jude's Seminary, a secluded institution meant to prepare gifted boys for the priesthood. The building no longer stands. It was consumed by fire less than a year later, but survivors of the seminary describe the event with a clarity that still chills the blood. It began during midnight mass on the last Sunday of Advent. The boys' choir, known for its eerily flawless intonation, had prepared a Latin hymn not listed in the liturgical schedule. No one knew where they had learned it. The melody was simple, but the notes bent strangely, holding dissonant tones for seconds too long. There were no instruments, only voice. And yet every candle in the sanctuary flickered blue. Witnesses say the sound was not human, though it came from their mouths. The music rippled through the stone floors. Parishioners clutched their ears, weeping. One man began speaking in a dialect no one could identify, possibly pre-Anglo-Gaelic. A pregnant woman fainted. 2 elderly priests vomited blood. The choir kept singing, and then they collapsed, one by one, mid-phrase, mid-breath, mid-note. All 13 boys fell to the floor, eyes open, smiles frozen, blood leaking from their noses in identical spirals. Not a single external injury. But an autopsy conducted by a physician from Lexington revealed something grotesque. Their tongues had split down the center, like serpents, and their vocal cords were missing, gone, cleanly severed, as if never there. No cuts, no scars, just void. The priest who oversaw the choir, Father Marius Leclerc, disappeared 3 days later. His quarters had been ransacked except for one object left untouched, a music sheet. One written in symbols that have never been translated. The notes aren't notes, they resemble seals or sigils, closer to Sumerian cuneiform than Western notation. The title at the top: Canticum Versorum, the Song of the Vessels. Scholars attempted to reconstruct the melody using AI acoustic modeling in 2019. They played only 5 seconds of the digital rendering before the lab's soundproof chamber cracked from inside. All files were deleted, Or so we were told, but one recording, low quality, muffled, still circulates on obscure message boards. It ends with a whisper, not a voice, a hiss. After the mass death of the 13 choir boys, the archdiocese immediately sealed St. Jude's Seminary and ordered silence. The parents were told the children had died of a gas leak, an accident, a fluke. Their bodies were never returned. But that wasn't the end. Because 3 children didn't die. 3 choir members had missed rehearsal that day, 2 with fevers, 1 with a broken leg. All 3 were in their dormitory during the hymn, and by dawn, none of them could speak. Their voices, gone, not from trauma, not from grief. Their vocal cords were intact, their mouths moved, their throats vibrated, but no sound came, not a breath, not a whisper, not even involuntary noises, coughs, hiccups, sneezes, nothing. Doctors examined them, priests prayed over them, nothing changed. All 3 were institutionalized by the church at Mount Haven Convalescent Home for Afflicted Children in rural Boyle County. The facility was operated by the Sisters of Perpetual Mourning, a cloistered order of nuns who had taken vows of silence themselves. Some say that's why the church chose them, so no one would speak of what the children tried to say. Because they did try. In desperate, anguished movements they wrote and drew, mostly scribbles, occasionally words. He opened the song inside our heads. The notes were not music, they were doors. He said we were keys, he needed the right ones. Who was he? The children only drew a shape. Not a man, not a beast. A figure with no face, but a neck ringed with mouths, singing. One nun broke her vow to write a letter to her sister, a former archivist in Florence. She described the boys' condition as not mute, but silenced, as if their voices had been locked in jars. She claimed the boys could hear each other's thoughts, though the church branded her insane and reassigned her. By 1853, all 3 boys had disappeared. The church claimed they had died, but their graves were filled with sand, and in the abandoned west wing of Mount Haven, someone carved the following into a concrete wall. Deep, jagged, furious, you don't bury keys, you hide them from the door. In 1854, a traveling bookseller named Howard Vance passed through a rural village in Tennessee, carrying with him a crate of old religious books salvaged from shuttered missions and auctioned convents. Among them was a small, leather-bound hymnal unmarked on the cover, bound in human-looking hide and containing no words, just black musical notation scribbled so erratically across the staff lines it looked like it had been written in a trance. Vance said he'd acquired it from a nun who'd fled Kentucky. He tried to sell the hymnal to a local pastor who refused, saying it reeked of mildew and mischief, so Vance kept it in his satchel. 2 days later, he vanished. A farmhand found the hymnal near an abandoned shack on the outskirts of town, surrounded by dead birds arranged in a perfect spiral. Vance's coat was hanging on a nearby tree, still warm, but Vance himself, gone. The sheriff took the hymnal into evidence. Within a week, 3 deputies were dead, 1 by hanging, 1 by drowning in a trough, and 1 found motionless at his desk, eyes wide open, blood dripping from his ears and nostrils, but no cause of death. The sheriff burned the hymnal in the town square. It did not burn. Instead, the pages turned on their own in the windless heat. A local schoolteacher who had studied Gregorian chant insisted the notes were notated backward, like a mirror composition, meant to be sung in reverse. She deciphered the first 2 lines. That night she was heard humming alone in her boarding room. By morning her body was discovered, eyes removed, fingers broken, with a final message smeared in blood on the floorboards. It wants to be sung. Terrified, the townspeople placed the hymnal in a lead box and buried it at the base of the oldest tree in the cemetery, one that had never bloomed, never aged, never lost its leaves. That tree was struck by lightning the same night. The next morning, the hymnal was back in the sheriff's office, open to a different page. No one in town spoke of it again, and in the years to come, No family in that village ever allowed their children to join choirs. The fear had soaked too deep. The sound had sunk into their blood. Because some music doesn't echo, it waits. In 1872, a small windswept mission outpost known only as St. Neria's Hollow was built in the Texas Panhandle, barely a dot on any map. Run by 4 aging nuns and a defrocked priest, it was meant to be a place of quiet repentance, but no one who went there ever stayed long. At the center of the chapel hung a bronze bell, supposedly cast from repurposed Civil War cannon metal. It had no rope, no lever, and yet it rang every evening at precisely 3:33 a.m. Locals said it sounded like a child weeping through steel. Those who heard it in person described unbearable chills and pressure in their ears, like being submerged underwater. The priest, Father Malric, claimed it was the sound of the damned recalling God's name too late. After the 4th month of its nightly tolling, the mission reported its first tragedy. A young novice nun slit her throat silently at her prayer bench, but before she died she'd carved something into the wood with her own fingernail. No more bells. Father Malric boarded up the chapel and had the bell removed, hauling it several miles out to the canyon ridge and hurling it into the ravine. The bell was back the next morning, dry, unchipped, hanging perfectly centered. That night, at 3:33 a.m., it rang louder than ever. A traveling bishop arrived weeks later, claiming he'd read of similar, resonant artifacts in Vatican documents dating back to 1483, when a bell in Ghent was said to contain the final breath of a martyred boy saint. That bell too had rung without cause, and it too had driven men to madness. The bishop demanded the bell be melted down. They tried, twice, but every furnace broke. Workers claimed they heard whispers in Latin as the metal began to glow, voices asking for names. When the bishop took it upon himself to bless the bell with holy water, it shattered his chalice and burned a symbol into the altar behind him. 3 eyes, interlocking circles with a vertical slash. That night, the bishop was found wandering the plains, speaking backwards and bleeding from his tongue. The mission was shuttered. The bell remains inside to this day. But no birds perch on its steeple, no sound echoes near its walls, and every year on July the 3rd, at exactly 3:33 a.m., it rings. Even though the chapel is empty, even though there's no one left to hear it. In 1901, at a seaside orphanage in Provincetown, Massachusetts, a boy was found at the gates just before dawn. He was about 8 years old, barefoot, and wearing a threadbare wool coat 2 centuries out of date. No name, no parents, no records. When asked who he was, the boy simply said, "I was hanged in 1692, my neck still hurts." The caretakers thought he was delusional or playing, but the boy never broke character. He insisted his name was Elias Fendrick, and that he had been a stable boy accused of witchcraft in the Salem trials. He said he was strangled by a judge's words and left hanging until the crows confessed for me. What began as an eerie curiosity quickly turned terrifying. The boy refused to sleep indoors. He built a small dirt circle in the garden, always facing north, where he sat cross-legged every night. He claimed the spot kept him safe from the voices that crawl beneath the skin of time. Then he began naming things no child should know, names of judges, town elders, and executioners from Salem history. Names lost to all but the most obscure court transcripts. He described a rope knot used only by 17th century marshals, and even identified the now ruined Gallows Hill site by smell alone when taken on a trip. One caretaker, Miss Agnes Holt, began documenting the boy's statements. She compared his words to historical records and was unnerved by their accuracy. Even his syntax and speech patterns mimicked archaic colonial English. Things took a darker turn when other children at the orphanage began having nightmares, visions of ash-filled skies, a blood-slicked noose, and a man with an eyeless face speaking in reversed Latin. One child had a seizure and, in a trance, repeated the same phrase over and over. Elias remembers the rope. Elias never forgets. The orphanage's chapel bell rang once at midnight without wind. Miss Holt, shaken, seen a nant for church authorities. But before help could arrive, Elias vanished. No sign of struggle, no footprints in the snow. Just a small hand-drawn gallows in the dirt where he'd slept, and the words, "He forgives none." To this day, the orphanage, now long abandoned, is considered one of the most spiritually volatile sites in New England. Paranormal investigators report that when EVP devices are used on the grounds, a faint child's voice can be heard whispering, "Do you remember me now?" Deep beneath the hills of Harlan County, Kentucky, lies an abandoned coal shaft known only by locals as Pit 6. It was sealed in 1910 after a mysterious collapse killed 37 men. But according to miners' journals and the last surviving shift records, it wasn't a collapse. It was a ritual gone wrong. The miners of Pit 6 weren't ordinary workers. Many were Italian and Welsh immigrants, but a small inner circle belonged to a secretive sect called the Brethren of the Black Ember. Their founder was a man named Cyrus Wainwright, a foreman who was rumored to own a strange human skull with no lower jaw and deep horn-like carvings etched into its crown. Wainwright claimed the skull belonged to a pre-Adamic being, a race that lived before the Garden of Eden. He believed it could drink the darkness and give visions of the first fire, a purifying force that would melt the false world and reveal the true. Every Friday night, miners reported hearing chanting from Shaft D, the deepest tunnel, voices that didn't match any language they knew, nor any human throat. Some said it sounded wet, like a throat full of oil. And then came the disappearances. First, 2 canary boys went missing. Then a crew of 3 men failed to report after a night shift. Wainwright claimed they had transcended flesh and that their bodies were returned to the ember. The mining company sent inspectors, but they never made it out. Their lamps were found extinguished, and strange charcoal drawings covered the shaft walls. A cracked throne, a mouth swallowing stars, and a headless miner bleeding black fire. The final straw came when the mine engineer, Arthur Bell, descended into Shaft D with a revolver and a priest. What they found turned their hair white. The tunnel had been transformed into a crude cathedral with rib-like supports wrapped in human skin and the skull resting on an altar of coal foe, said with teeth. Bell shot Wainwright in the head, but the bullet never pierced his skull. Instead, Wainwright smiled, bled ink from his nose, and said, "You're not shooting me. You're waking him." The mine collapsed 3 hours later. To this day, nothing grows near Pit 6. Locals say on the anniversary of the collapse you can hear pickaxes tapping in sync, as if still digging. Not for coal, for something beneath coal, something older than heat. Then, there's a tiny town in Bell County, Kentucky that doesn't appear on most maps. It's called Mercy Hollow, and locals just call it The Hollow. It sits in a steep bowl of hills, quiet and unremarkable, except for one event that's been passed down like a ghost story wrapped in static. On the night of September the 13th, 1933, every single clock, watch, and timepiece in the town of Mercy Hollow stopped at exactly 3:07 a.m. Not 3:06, not 3:08. Every timekeeper ceased to tick at the same moment. The Baptist preacher's grandfather clock froze. The train depot's wall clock halted mid-tick. Even pocket watches in drawers and children's alarm clocks on nightstands, dead still at 3:07. The oddity might have been dismissed as a coincidence until the dogs began howling. One by one, like a signal being passed from one backyard to the next. Then the radios kicked on, without electricity. Locals recall the same frequency across all sets, even the ones unplugged. A woman's voice, soft, British, repeating the same sentence. "We are returning, we never left. We are returning, we never left." Over and over, for 13 minutes. Then silence. Then screaming from old Orson Wakefield's house. His wife claimed he had stood up in bed, eyes still shut, and walked out into the woods without shoes, pants, or a word. 5 men searched for him. They found only a trail of blood, a wedding ring melted into stone, and, beneath a dry creek bed, a mirror the size of a barn door, buried flat and pulsing with heat. And in the center of that mirror, pressed against the glass, was his reflection, but much older, thinner, mouth wide open, eyes hollowed like burned-out stars. They covered it with dirt and prayed. But it didn't end there. Each year after that, on September the 13th, all the clocks would still freeze at 3:07 a.m., except now they'd all tick backward for 13 minutes. And every time someone in the town would either disappear or return, but never the same. Children came back with grey hair. Wives came back speaking other languages, and one man returned 27 years older with carvings on his back that spelled in Latin, "The hollow was not built on land, it was built on a wound, and it is still bleeding." Just as the world was tightening its grip on modernity, something ancient stirred again in Illinois. In 1937, a group of soil researchers and folklorists arrived at the site once known as Whistler's Field. Their goal was simple: document the strange phenomena reported nearly a century earlier. They brought with them new equipment, a primitive phonograph, tape recorders, and even a Geiger counter, though radiation wasn't yet understood. They camped on the edge of the field, recording the nights. What they captured wasn't the wind, not wildlife, but voices. Low, droning, layered, whispered in a tongue neither dead nor alive. When reversed, the recording revealed a chilling phrase, spoken over and over: "She should not have spoken." But it wasn't just the sound that unnerved them. The soil tests showed traces of unidentified organic compounds, residues that didn't match any known plant, animal, or mineral. And then, one of the researchers disappeared. His tent was found open, his shoes lined up neatly at the edge of the camp. The phonograph was shattered, its needle gouged deep into the wood. In the days that followed, the field itself seemed to shift. Grass swirled into impossible spirals, taller than a man. Locals reported hearing the death choir's song even though the area was empty. The folklore had been true. Whistler's Field had never been a cemetery, it was a threshold. A place where voices refused to stay silent, where the dead did not rest, where the land itself remembered the forgotten and sang their names aloud, whether the living wished to hear or not. In the dense forests of southeastern Ohio lies a place locals refuse to enter, the Singing Woods. For centuries, whispers spoke of a pact made long ago between settlers and the unseen entities residing deep beneath the earth. In 1942, a group of soldiers stationed nearby reported hearing strange melodies wafting through the trees at night, soft, hypnotic songs that seemed to seep directly into their minds. One soldier, Private James Abernathy, kept a journal detailing his descent into obsession. He wrote of hearing voices chanting in languages that made his skin crawl, words promising power but demanding sacrifice. Then came the disappearances. Men vanished without trace during routine patrols. The surviving soldiers spoke of a shadow moving between the trees, something not quite human, something that sang. Locals recalled a centuries-old tale of a secret deal, where settlers promised blood and silence in exchange for protection against the wilderness. The Singing Woods, it was said, were alive, feeding off those who dared cross their path. A rescue team found Abernathy's journal near a hollow tree, its pages smeared with blood and strange symbols. The final entry read, "The song calls me home. It remembers my name. I cannot resist the chorus beneath the roots." The forest claimed him. Today, the Singing Woods remain off-limits, shrouded in an eerie quiet. But sometimes, when the wind is just right, a faint choir can be heard echoing through the branches, a reminder of a pact no one remembers but the earth itself. Beneath the soil of Whistler's Field, long thought barren except for its eerie history, an underground crypt was discovered in 1949 by construction workers digging for a new railway line. The crypt was unlike any other, built with stone so dark it seemed to absorb light. Its walls bore carvings of spirals and faces distorted in silent screams. Most disturbing was the presence of what appeared to be a human choir's skeletal remains, arranged upright in ritualistic rows, their jaws open as if in eternal song. Archaeologists were baffled, and most refused to enter the crypt after the first inspection. Several workers who explored the site reported a chilling sensation, describing whispers in a language no one could comprehend, pressing against their minds. The site was quickly sealed by authorities, but local legends spoke of a chilling truth. The crypt was the origin of the Death Choir, a group whose songs could manipulate the living, bend reality, and summon forces from beyond. A local priest, Father Matthias, who was tasked with blessing the site, recorded in his journal a final, unsettling note. The voices do not cease with death. The song is a trap, one that sings for those who listen and devours their souls. The crypt remains sealed to this day, a forbidden place where the dead still sing and the living should never listen. In 1956, a group of folklorists and sound engineers ventured into the remote hills of Kentucky, chasing legends of the silent choir, the three boys who lost their voices decades earlier but were rumored to communicate through music none could hear. Equipped with state-of-the-art recording devices, the team set up camp near the ruins of the Mount Haven convalescent home. They aimed to capture any remaining traces of the choir's mysterious influence. On the second night, they recorded what sounded like inaudible vibrations, a low-frequency hum that seemed to permeate the ground itself. Later, when technicians slowed the tape down, an eerie melody emerged. It was a song composed of frequencies beyond human hearing, yet somehow felt deeply familiar, as if it were etched into the very fabric of existence. One member of the team, Dr. Evelyn Shaw, reported feeling disoriented and unable to speak after listening to the recording. Her colleagues described her as changed, withdrawn, and obsessed with the idea that the song held the secrets of the void. Weeks later, Dr. Shaw disappeared without a trace, leaving behind a single note scribbled in her journal. The choir sings still, but in silence they command. Listen not with ears, but with the soul. The recording was confiscated by government agents and classified as hazardous. It vanished from public knowledge. But echoes of the silent choir's song continue to haunt those who dare to seek the forbidden melody. In 1963, a secretive group known only as the Bell Keepers emerged in rural Illinois, near the site of the infamous Whistler's Field. Little is known about their origins, but they were rumored to be the last guardians of the black bell discovered decades earlier, the one that hummed instead of rang. The bell keepers believed that the bell was not just an object, but a gateway, a conduit for voices from another realm. They held nightly vigils, singing hymns meant to appease the silent chorus trapped within. But something went horribly wrong. One night, during a particularly violent storm, the bell's hum turned into a piercing scream that echoed across the countryside. The keepers vanished without a trace, leaving behind only scorched earth and shattered glass. Local legend says the bell still calls out on stormy nights, searching for new keepers to join its endless song, and those who hear it are never the same. You've come far, farther than most ever dare to look. Now the final truth waits, not in words, but in the silence between them. The song you've heard, the melodies that ripple through centuries of horror and memory, were never just songs. They are keys forged from fear, faith, and forbidden knowledge, carved by voices who understood that sound could break chains, but also bind souls forever. The bell that refused to toll, the choir that sang themselves into death, the blackened hymnal that carried the whispers of the void. All pieces of a puzzle too dangerous to complete, because the song is alive. It listens, it waits, for the one who will finally sing it fully. And when that happens, the gates will open, the ground will bleed, the silence will swallow, and the world will forget who dared to listen. You have been shown what lies beneath the surface. You have heard the unhearable. You have glimpsed the forbidden. But be warned, there is no turning back. Only the next note. Only the next step deeper into the dark. If you understand this, if you accept it, then declare now, the silence is mine, the silence is mine. Speak it twice. Let the words bind you. seal your path, and awaken your true self, because now you walk with the song, and the song walks with you.